just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some books. Talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hey everybody, I'm Joe.
And I'm JoJo, and this is Canonical Nonsense.
And we are just two Joe Schmoes reading books.
And today we are going to talk about His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik.
Some background on this book. His Majesty's Dragon, also known as Temeraire in the UK, is part of a larger series with the title also Temeraire. And it is the first book of 9 in the series. It was Naomi Novik's debut novel. This series asks the question of what if the Napoleonic War was fought with dragons? If you think that Naomi Novik's name sounds familiar, you may also know her from the Scholomance series or from her standalone Spinning Silver or Uprooted, which JoJo and I have read. So this is like the last book series of hers that we hadn't read.
I haven't read Uprooted, but we did specifically pick Naomi Novik because we like her. And we were praying for a good book because this isn't a dunk podcast. It's a book review podcast, even though we've been so negative lately.
But she delivered.
So delivered.
This was a great book. And her debut novel, I'm really impressed for a debut novel. This was fantastic too. Also, I do want to just mention, I think I said that this was Master and Commander fan fiction in the last episode when we were talking about this book. It isn't actually Master and Commander fan fiction. She had been writing a ton of Master and Commander fan fiction, and then she created this premise, but the characters didn't quite fit with what she wanted to do. So it's inspired by Master and Commander, but the characters are different. And it does really feel like it's inspired by it, but not the same. If you are a big fanfic reader, Naomi Novik actually started AO3, which is a huge fanfic website. So you have her to thank. All right. So would you recommend this book, JoJo?
We actually have already recommended this book since reading it to other people, your friends specifically, and they have read more books than we have. So it's a good rec.
Yeah, I recommended this to my friend less than a week ago, and she texted me this morning saying that she had finished the 3rd book in less than a week. So, wow. Go read this book. So we are a spoiler-rich podcast. So if you want to read this book and you don't want it to be spoiled for you, I would suggest logging off now. We'll be here when you are finished and we can talk about it together. Go read it. It's great. That being said, if you're okay with spoilers, listen in. We're going to get into the meat of this book. What, if any, trigger warnings do you think there were in this book?
I'm the worst person about this, but warfare, battle, death.
Yeah, general war and death, but not gratuitous violence, I think, by any means.
Yeah, it's a pretty PG book, even when it gets a little sexy.
The sex, I think, if you blink, you'll miss it in this book. But if you don't like when the dog dies in the movie or the book, there is a minor dragon who does pass away in this book, and it is quite sad. So if you really hate that when that happens, just be aware that that happens here. But it's not the main dragon, it's a side dragon. It's a pretty PG book. Anything else you want to say before we jump into the plot?
No, I think we should dive in.
All right, so we begin this book at the end of a naval battle. The French captain is surrendering his sword to the captain of the British ship, who is our main character, William Lawrence. Lawrence is frustrated with the French captain because he fought longer than he should have, even though it was very clear that he was going to lose, and Lawrence feels that he sacrificed more of his men than was necessary. Lawrence is a very lawful good character, so he finds this very reckless and dishonorable. Apparently, like, the process is you're supposed to give the sword back once the sword is offered, but he's like, I'm not giving this guy's sword back. So he keeps it.
Yeah, I would say he's like a very gentleman character. He cares about etiquette a lot, but lawful good is a very fantasy podcast way of describing it.
I mean, he's so lawful good, he gets in his own way at points, I think. Well, we can talk about it.
100%. He's all about duty and manners over everything. And, you know,
structure of power.
Sure. But at different points, the book considers this like a good thing and a bad thing, you know?
Yeah.
It's a conversation within the book about very gentlemanly and like duty bound and like hierarchical behaviors and like how they exist and like how you can work within them. It's just like a fun flavoring of it.
Totally. He then learns that the friendship was actually transporting a dragon egg, and he realizes that that is why they fought so long and hard to try to win the battle, even when they knew all was lost. So he actually does give the captain his sword back, which I thought was kind of a sweet moment. They move the dragon egg to his ship, and he and his crew put their names in a hat to decide who will bond the dragon if it hatches. They have I think he's the doctor, right? On the ship, knows a little bit about dragons.
The doctor is such a funny character because all of these like officers are just like not into this dragon. They're just like, oh, I don't want anything to do with this dragon. Being an aviator, which is what they call a dragon rider, is like the worst. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But the doctor is like, I love dragons. Only one excited about this dragon. Super excited about dragons. Is very cute.
If you've seen the movie Master and Commander, he is the doctor from Master and Commander, just like Lawrence is the Russell Crowe's character from Master and Commander. So they put their names into a hat to decide who will bond the dragon if it hatches. A crewman who unfortunately is very afraid of heights is the name that's drawn. Do you want to explain why this is not something that people want?
I feel like a part of dragon books and each dragon is that they have their own language and like terms that they use for it.
Mm-hmm.
Bond a dragon isn't really a thing in this, even though it's so much a part of the canon that we're using it as shorthand at the moment. They call it harness a dragon because they literally harness a dragon. Basically, all of these officers are like gentlemen, and by gentlemen we mean like upper class people. So they're specifically given to the military early from middle class, but middle class doesn't really mean middle class in England. It's like it's sort of like upper class households, like people who are rich but not necessarily like aristocrats, and then they like work their way up. So they're accustomed to a certain level of comforts. They like go to balls. They're part of society essentially.
Yeah.
And to be an aviator, you have a giant dragon that eats a lot of meat and is not the nicest. Well, they perceive as like not the nicest or friendliest animal, so they have to like.
Also, when JoJo says they're huge, like some of these dragon breeds are like 50 tons. So huge. Not just kind of big, but like huge.
Yeah, like able to carry comfortably dozens of people on their back, like very huge. Yeah. So they require a lot of space and require constant maintenance. We're seeing a very Navy perspective of like this. We get a very different perspective as we go on through the book, but like the Navy perspective is like, you can't go to society because you have to hang out in the woods because your dragon's a big monster that eats things. And like you can't go to the opera anymore. And there's no real retirement.
And how could you get married because your wife would be second to a dragon is one of the things they say. So you can't really have any relationships like that with humans. Your dragon is your human.
So that's why no one on the ship wants to be an aviator. At least that's the common perspective of being an aviator. And to a gentleman, it sucks.
Yeah. So anyway, they bring the dragon egg onto the deck because it's about to hatch. So when a dragon egg is about to hatch, it hardens. The shell is kind of soft beforehand, and then it starts to, become an actual like a chicken egg shell. So it begins to harden, and it's a huge egg. I forget exactly how large they say it is, but it's huge. And they know that they have to put a harness on this dragon and speak to it to get it to consent to be a more domesticated dragon. If it eats or flies before they get a harness on it, it will always be feral. So there is this difference between feral dragons and, these harnessed bonded dragons, where feral dragons can still be used for breeding if they're offered like a nice place to stay and some good mates to breed with and some good food to eat, but they will never allow someone to ride them, and they won't speak to humans. So it's really important that they get this harness on right away, because if they don't, then they're going to lose this dragon. And it becomes very clear very early on in the book that even one dragon could really turn the tide of this war, and the war that we're talking about is the Napoleonic War. where dragons are these really important strategic weapons.
They sort of set the stage early in the war where it's France has more dragons, but Britain has better dragons.
Yeah.
So even one dragon can really turn the tide of the war for them. And that's why it's so important that they have to harness it. They just can't let it get feral. There's this like strong sense of duty to, Britain. It's called His Majesty's Dragon for a reason. It's about commitment to the war effort. So that's why it's so important that someone has to, in their own opinion, ruin their life to like hang out with this dragon, which is, I think, just like a fun take on the dragon rider thing because everyone's so, being a dragon rider sounds so fun and cool in all of the books we read.
Yeah.
And it's just like fun to have like a little subversion in this one.
Yeah. Also, they don't know what kind of dragon is in this egg. Apparently, it's kind of hard to tell from the egg what the species or I guess it's more of a breed because they can breed with each other. What breed it is, so they're kind of waiting to see what this dragon is, but they know it's going to be a bigger version because it is a really big egg. So the dragon hatches and it like starts kind of crawling around the ship. It's all black. It has these really beautiful 6-segmented wings. I think I have a description of it actually. The shell broke almost straight down the middle, and the two halves were flung apart onto the deck, as if by the occupants' impatience. The dragonette was left amid bits and pieces, shaking itself out vigorously on the pillow. It was still covered in slime of the interior and shone wet and glossy under the sun. Its body was a pure, untinted black from nose to tail, and a sigh of wonder ran throughout the crew as it unfurled its large 6-spined wings like a lady's fan, the bottom edge dappled with oval markings in gray and dark glowing blue. So he's a beautiful dragon. And he starts crawling around the ship and he's kind of like exploring a little bit in this kind of awkward way because he's a little baby. And they're kind of motioning for the crewmen to put the harness on. And it's this really like poorly constructed harness that they've just did last minute because they didn't have any actual dragon harnesses. And it eventually just sidles up to Lawrence and says to him, "Well, why are you frowning?" And they're all just like, "Oh my God, the dragon just spoke." And Lawrence says to him, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frown." And then he asks the dragon for its name, and it's like, "Well, I don't have a name." So he then names it Temeraire after a French ship.
It's not a friendship. It's an English ship. It's just
Oh,
like
it
a
was.
really cool ship that Lauren saw. It's
Oh.
it's such a great scene because if you're a dog owner and you've ever been like, "Here, boy," that's exactly what the crew member who was supposed to like
Yeah.
harness. It was like he was like, "Hey, come here, dragon. I've got a dragon, please." No, and then the dragon, nothing to do with him, does not care. Wanders up to Lawrence. He's like, "Yo, why are you frowning?" And then Lawrence is like, "Gah!" And he's like, I'm sorry." And then he's like, "Hey, do you want to be in this harness?"
Yeah, he's very cute about it. He's like, "Let me put this harness on you." And Tamar's like, "I suppose."
And then Lawrence asks him like, what's your name?" And then Temeraire is like, "Oh, I don't have a name because even though I can speak English, I was literally born 2 minutes ago." And he's like, "How about uh looks at a boat, thinks about a different boat, Temeraire." And he's like, "Dope," names it. Great
Yeah,
scene.
he likes the name. So they feed him a goat and he eats the whole thing. And it's just like, it's very funny the way that it's described that they eat because it's just like the most gruesome. I think it's the goat was slaughtered. It's not like he's devouring a live goat, but it's like he's just tearing into this gore. But it's described in kind of this way that like Lawrence is acknowledging it, but not like really thinking about it. So it's this like kind of feeling of removal from the fact that this animal is just going ham on this piece of meat, and he just like covered in gore. So Lawrence like cleans him up, and it's just very cute. Lawrence gives his command to his first mate because if he gives his command to his first mate now, his first mate has a better chance of becoming captain once they get to port. And he also is like, "Well, I'm not going to be a captain now because I was dragon." So he's just trying to pass on that command so that that transition is a little bit smoother. And he stays with the dragon as it eats. It falls asleep, grows really, really fast over the next few in the short period of time as they're making their way to port. And this dragon is so freaking cute. He's so cute. I love him.
There's a really great dichotomy of Lawrence being like, "My life is over, everything I've worked to up until this moment is at like ending," and the dragon being like, "I love being alive and on a boat."
Yeah, he is so, like, curious and inquisitive. It really reminds me of, like, if you're at, like, a barbecue or, like, a family reunion or something, and suddenly there's a five-year-old beside you, and you're like, "I don't know whose kid this is, and where are your parents?" And you're suddenly the one in charge of that five-year-old, and you're trying to kind of get them to not do anything that would be dangerous to them or others, but you kind of have to negotiate with them because you have no real authority over them because, you're not their parent and you're not their caretaker. So you're just like, "Oh, well, like, why don't we do this thing instead?" So, like, Temeraire will be like, "Why don't we fly today?" And Lawrence is like, "No, no, no, let's do this instead." And Temeraire's like, "Oh, okay." It's very cute. It's so cute.
It's just delightful.
It is delightful. As they're making their way through to this port, a storm does come along, and Temeraire again is so cute because he's like, "What's that lightning? What's causing it?" And Lawrence is like, "Oh, I don't know." And he's like, "Well, we could go up and look," which is wonderful. And then one of the men does get pulled overboard, and Lawrence and Temeraire actually is the one who spots him. He's like, "There's a guy in the water." And Temeraire is like, "I'll go get him." And this is the first time he flies. So he takes Lawrence on his back and they fly and they're able to save the man. And Temeraire kind of seems to think nothing of it. He's just like, "Okay." And Lawrence kind of realizes that he's been kind of cold to Temeraire. So after they save the man, he's like, "That was very well done." And Temeraire's like, "Oh,
Yeah, it's Lawrence really warms up to Tamarin in that scene, but also you really see that like Lawrence and Tamarin's like early working relationship because Temeraire is like, I'm gonna fly directly into the wind and
yeah."
can't and like is not doing it. And Lawrence is like a across the wind literally shows Tamarin how to cut across it, and then like Tamarin swoops down so Lawrence can grab the guy. So it's
Yeah.
like teamwork makes the dream work super off the bat early.
Yeah, and also Lawrence is able to use his naval because that's kind of how they would have to move a ship. He's able to use that knowledge to help Temeraire navigate the wind, which is really cool to see. They kind of realize like, "Oh, well, we could take him," because they're running out of meat really rapidly. They're fishing, but they're not able to get enough to feed him because he's just eating constantly and he's growing really, really fast. So Lawrence is like, "Well, we could take Temeraire flying and he could catch his own fish." And so they do this, and this is like a sweet scene until he catches a porpoise and like just like eviscerates it, which is like, "Ooh." But it does work really well. So they go flying like this often as they make their way back to port, and Temeraire gets really used to the water and he likes to swim.
I was gonna say, just to like interrupt you, I feel
Mhm.
like something I've noticed that's maybe like part of the canon of dragon books is like the first flight. Aragon had this, and so did Kern, where the first time they get on their dragons and they fly, it's like this beautiful, wonderful experience. And it's like they love them so much and they feel really connected. And it's this Lawrence kind of sort of changes his tune a little bit because he's like
Yeah.
flying is so much fun. So it's really interesting now that we've been going through the books for a while, be able to like see Lawrence's first flight. And it's just to catch some fish, but like to really enjoy that. It's always like kind of a quiet scene too. No one's ever first flight is like, and then I guess sort of, but like the first
Aragon
real
almost like
flight.
fell off his dragon the first time.
Yeah,
It
I guess
that flight
it.
is more scary.
Yeah. All right. I changed exactly what I said. Both Aragon and this book have their first flight where people almost die. And it's bad because Lawrence is strapped to Tamaran. He like almost loses the circulation in his legs the way he's like strapped to
Oh,
Tamaran, and they
yeah.
have cut him out of it, and it's like a whole thing. And the same thing is sort of true for Aragon, who like scrapes the crap out of his legs. But like is a scene where they go on like their first joyride essentially, and that's always like a really fun and delightful scene.
Yeah, this and he's, like, watching Temeraire, and Temeraire can hover, which Temeraire's he's like, "Well, how are you doing that?" And Temeraire's like, "Oh, I don't know, I'm just doing it." While he's looking over the water, and he spots the porpoise before Lawrence can see it, so Lawrence is like, "Oh, wow, he really can see very far." So he's, like, having this kind of wonder at seeing what his dragon can do, which is quite sweet. Also, when they finish, like, hunting, he, like, cleans off Temeraire, so he's always, like, cleaning Temeraire and bathing him, and then they have started to sleep on the deck because he's too big to sleep in the cabin. So Lawrence just like cuddles with him and they read together. It's very, very cute. Their relationship is like, and they just talk to each other. Yeah, so they make it to port. Temeraire is very excited to be in port, and Lawrence is like, stay here and I'll bring you some veal because you've never had veal before and you're gonna like it. And Temeraire is like, well, I could just eat those things over there, and he points to carriage horses, which is really funny. And Lawrence is like, don't eat those. You can't eat like anything that I don't tell you to eat. You can't eat because it could belong to someone. And Temeraire is like, well, I don't understand that, but I'll listen to you. So Lawrence is like really stressed as he makes his way to meet his superior to be dismissed from the Navy. And he has this conversation, and he is dismissed to join the Aerial Corps, and he is sent to kind of stay at a cottage with Temeraire.
But you're cutting some of the best parts out, which is
okay.
So we sort of see Lawrence, like good guy Lawrence in this, where Lawrence is always shown. Yeah, Lawrence always is shown as like standing up for the people below him, and you sort of see his love of formality in here because he like walks in to like be relieved, and the guy's like, good God, man, you didn't have to do it yourself. You should have made one of your like lower people do it. And at first he's like, excuse me, like he like takes it as an insult, and there's very British gentlemanly squabbling over stuff. And then at one point the person who's relieving him of duty doesn't want to let his, I guess it was his second lieutenant, because his first lieutenant went to the French ship, be the captain. And the guy is like kind of trying to angle for his own dude to like become the captain. And Lawrence is like, I didn't take this dragon so I could like give my first mate my ship, you know? Like,
yeah.
He does not say like, but he's like,
excuse me, I didn't take this dragon, so like that's what he sounds like. I can't think of him as anyone other than Russell Crowe because of Master and Commander, but I think Russell Crowe is a little bit older than Lawrence.
Yeah, I always see him as Carrie Hughes just because like the first thing they describe is him wiping blood from his blonde hair and like a pirate ship. So I always think of him as Carrie Hughes from Princess Bride, even though they're not at all similar. They both talk very formally though.
Yeah.
But he sticks up for his first mate. He uses British manners to like get what he wants. And it's just it's a very, I was like making notes of all the very British scenes, and this is like one of the more British.
Yeah. It is a super British scene. I feel like I was like, any scene that Temeraire isn't in, I don't care about because he's just so cute. But yeah, that is a good scene. Well, also there's a scene when they're still on the boat where Lawrence is eating with his crew and they're talking about fire-breathing dragons. And when he comes back up to Temeraire, Temeraire's like, will I be able to breathe fire? And Lawrence is like, I don't know, because not all dragon breeds can breathe fire. And some of them can spit acid, but not all of them. And then Temeraire is like, I tried to breathe fire, but only air came out, which is so cute because, like, if he had been able to breathe fire, he would have set the ship on fire. But he really kind of wants to breathe fire. That comes up a few times in the book where he's like, will I be able to breathe fire? Anyway, while they're waiting to be assigned, they go flying. And this scene is also quite sweet because it shows how inquisitive Temeraire is and how really patient Lawrence is. And I think not just patient, but like how much he's starting to really appreciate and admire Temeraire. Temeraire is kind of walking through this hillside and he's looking at the grass and all the flowers, and he's looking up at the movement of the clouds, and he'll just sit and like watch the movement of the clouds. Lawrence is kind of able to experience the world in a new way because he's seeing it the way that Temeraire is seeing it, and it's really, really quite sweet. And he's really starting to realize how much he loves this dragon. And like then Temeraire finds this little piece of pyrite and he's like, ooh, he's so excited by it, and he has to like push it to Lawrence because it's too small for him to pick up with his claws. And Lawrence is like, oh, so you must be a kind of like a breed of dragon who really likes gold. And Temeraire is like, is it gold? And Lawrence is like, no, it's pyrite, but it's quite beautiful. And he says to Temeraire, I think you picked the wrong person to be your rider because I'll never be able to get you a pile of gold to sleep on. And Temeraire is like, oh, well, I would rather sleep with you no matter how comfortable a pile of gold is. And it's just so cute. Oh.
Lawrence is literally like, it's like if my ship was like, "I like you and you did a good job," which is like a weird thing, and it's so cute. Lawrence is sort of realizing, and I don't know if we mentioned this, but Lawrence has been reading to Temeraire pretty regularly.
Yeah.
Temeraire is not only, like, smarter than he thought, but also just a really good companion.
Yeah. And a good companion specifically for Lawrence. But
Mhm.
Lawrence also finds that, like, there are some things that Temeraire is interested in learning that Lawrence is not. So I don't know where in the book this is, but there's one point where Temeraire asks him if he can buy some books on mathematics because Temeraire is interested in mathematics. And Lawrence is like, "Oh, I don't like mathematics," but he finds that he's totally fine with reading to Temeraire about any subject because he really enjoys that inquisitive nature of Temeraire, and he knows that he'll still find it enjoyable even if it's not a subject that he immediately finds enjoyable, which is really just this mark of love.
Yeah, it's about halfway through the book, I believe, when that happens, but reading is, like, a really important part of the relationship, and it's really cute. Book
Yeah.
nerd dragon.
He's so cute. Lawrence then, when he's in town the next day, he buys a gold chain for Temeraire because he's like, "Oh, like, he likes gold." And Temeraire is so excited, like, he keeps looking at it that night when Lawrence is reading to him, he keeps touching it with his tip of his little nose, and he asks Lawrence to attach it to the front of his harness because he's just so excited about having this little piece of gold. Lawrence then writes to this man who's a dragon enthusiast named Sir Edward Howell because they're trying to figure out what breed Temeraire is, and they haven't been able to figure it out yet. And then they travel to meet him. Hal tells him that he is a Chinese dragon and that he is an imperial dragon because there's this other breed that's a celestial, but he's like, there's no way you're a celestial. And that this breed is very, very rare in Europe. He's probably the only imperial in all of Europe because China really heavily guards its breeding practices. So really not much is known about them at all, which I think is like a nod to China's exports at this time because China had like a lot of things that Europe really wanted. I specifically know that China had, porcelain and Europe was like, "How are you making this?" And China was like, "We're not telling," because they were, exporting it. And it took Europe way longer than it should have to figure out how to make porcelain. But this was like a huge moneymaker for China. And there were other things that weren't porcelain that China was able to provide Europe that Europe didn't have. And I think that this is a nod to that trade process that China had and the East had with Europe.
I think it's a fantasy element that's very heavily based on the fact that different cultures have different types of dragons. So the dragons described in the book are more similar to like more traditional Chinese dragons, and we still have the European dragons.
Yeah, so Temeraire has 5 claws, where European dragons have 4 claws, and the 5 claw is specifically a reference to the dragon motif on the emperor's clothing. The 5-clawed dragon could only be on the emperor's clothing because it was a symbol of the emperor, so if a dragon had fewer than 5 claws, it might have been, like, a lower class person who had that dragon motif, but I think it was punishable by death if you had a dragon with 5 claws on your like, you use that motif and you weren't the emperor.
Sounds about right for, how monarchs work. I think it's a fun world building element where you get to introduce these different types of dragons, and like also talk about a little bit how different cultures have approached dragons,
Mhm.
because part of the reason that the Chinese dragons are so cool is that they just domesticated them like way earlier,
Yeah.
which I think is a nod to like how much older Chinese civilizations are than like certain European civilizations. So it was just like a nice tiny bit of world building.
Yeah, they also bred the dragons for intelligence specifically in China, so Temeraire is more intelligent than other dragon breeds.
Just one more thing I'd like to add is Sir Edward Howe tells Lawrence that it has to be an imperial dragon, and that if he was a celestial dragon, then China would go to war with Britain to get him back, and then goes like, "Good thing he's not that type of dragon." Looks directly into camera. This will not come up again.
Yeah, there's a lot of points in this story where you're like, this story is a capital S story TM at the end, where like we know because it follows the beat of a story that this thing is the thing that it's going to be. So like as soon as he brings that up, you as the reader are like, okay, so he is a celestial then. this is absolutely going to be the case. And then there are a few other places. There's this one spot in the book where I was just like, this can't be, because that would be too obvious. And then I realized later that I was actually right. But I'll get to that when we get to that.
Call it really good foreshadowing.
Yeah,
You know
yeah.
what's gonna happen. If you're paying attention, you can follow the beats and they all make sense.
The book is well constructed enough that it doesn't feel like it's contrived or that it's just following beats to follow beats. It feels like, it's following this very traditional structure of a story.
Giving the reader the information they need to be able to follow the story. And so
Yeah.
when plot points come up later, you're not like, "What?" It's like, "Oh, yeah, they mentioned that back in"
Yeah, so Temeraire also does ask Hao if he's like, "Will this mean that I'll be able to breathe fire?" And Hao is like, "Oh no, probably not." And Temeraire's kind of bummed because he really wants to breathe fire. They also like play in the bay. He and Lawrence like play and swim around in the bay together, and Lawrence kind of has this boyish moment where he's like splashing around and really playing. And he's like a little embarrassed with himself because he's like, I hope no one saw that. But also like Temeraire and Temeraire's childlike wonder is allowing him to kind of experience his this childlike wonder again, and so he's able to kind of fit back into this more playful space that he hadn't been in for a really long time.
I mean, he went to the Navy when he was 12,
Yeah,
so he never he got a very small childhood, so it's really
yeah.
nice to and the Navy is so regimented, so which he talks about, so it's nice to see him, like, kind of be like, "Oh, I don't have to be like this buttoned-up guy."
Yeah, it's really sweet. So on their way back, they encounter their first other dragon. It's this messenger dragon, and it kind of trumps at them, and then Temeraire kind of roars for the first time, and he's kind of confused by it. He's like, "Ooh." And we learn that not all dragons are as smart as Temeraire. Though I wasn't sure if this dragon is the breed that wasn't as smart, or if this dragon just had a little bit of was a little slow.
I think messenger dragons are a little bit slow, but this seems like the slowest dragon we meet.
He's really sweet though.
He's perfect. He's just like, "I'm here. I like to go fast."
Yeah, he's really, really fast. He goes by Wally, but his name is like Waleritas, I think. And Temeraire tries to talk to him and he's just like, "Hi." And then Temeraire's like, "Oh." And then Lawrence is like, "Be nice to him." And the writer of Wally is also kind of sweet. He's like, "Oh, I didn't know there was a dragon here." And Lawrence is talking to him while Wally is eating with Temeraire. And he's like, "Temeraire, share your dinner with him." So Temeraire shares the cows with him. And the dragon's like, "Cows!" And the courier guy is like, "Oh, it's unusual that a dragon would be willing to share his meal with a smaller dragon, because this dragon is much smaller than Temeraire." And so they're talking, and the courier guy, the human, is like, "Oh, well, I'll just go now and like I'll tell them and they'll be here tomorrow." And you kind of do get the sense that this guy is, even though his dragon is not probably as intelligent, I mean, is definitely not as intelligent as Temeraire, or is not able to really speak in the same capacity as Temeraire, that he still has this really, really strong bond with his dragon, and he would rather be riding around with his dragon than anywhere else. And they have this really sweet relationship, even though he's not on screen for very much of time. Then he immediately leaves. Wally tries to say Temeraire's name and he can't do it. And the dragons in this are just so cute. And so anyway, the next day the Dragon Corps does come. I think they come on a royal copper, but I'm not sure, which is a huge dragon. Do you remember?
I do not even a little bit.
They find him in town. They tell him that they would replace him in the same way that they would replace a rider who's died. And so he can't come to see Temeraire. He can't say goodbye. He has to just stay away. And Lawrence is really broken up about this, and he kind of doesn't understand why, because at first he's like, "Oh, well, I'll be able to get my life back." But he realizes he doesn't want his life back. Slowly over the course of the night, he's eating dinner with his two crew members, and they're like giving each other looks because they're like, "Oh man, he's not happy about this." And he's just starting to realize that Temeraire is something special, and that he wouldn't want to return back to his old life now that he knows what it could be like with his dragon. But someone does come and tells him that he has to come back to his cottage. When he gets there, the person who is supposed to replace him, he kind of insults him and the Navy, and Lawrence wants to duel him for his honor, but then the higher up is like, you can't duel if you're part of the Dragon Corps, because if you die, your dragon might not bond another person, and we would lose the dragon, so you can't do that. We also learn that this guy is really just upset because Temeraire did reject him. So Lawrence then goes to Temeraire, and Temeraire is just so distraught because this guy like told him that Lawrence didn't want to be with him anymore, that he would rather go back to his ship. He also says that they tried to take his chain away, and he's clutching the chain and looking at it, and he's really, really upset. And you just like, you want to duel this guy reading this, because what the fuck? How could you say that?
How could you hurt our poor sweet baby boy?
Yeah, and like it wouldn't work on Temeraire because he's really smart, but it might have worked on a dragon like Wally. And you just, you have to think about that, and it like hurts. So Lawrence reassures him, and he basically says like, I wouldn't want the finest ship in the ocean if I can have you as my dragon. And Temeraire says to him, he's like, well, if you want to go back to the ship, I would take another rider. Maybe not that guy, but maybe a different guy if that's what you want. And then he's like, of course I don't want to do that. And they fall asleep together. And it's just a really sweet scene, but it is gut-wrenching when you learn how upset Temeraire was.
It's a very Lawrence, you spent the beginning of the book absolutely dreading being an aviator, is like, all right, sign me up. I'm in it to win it.
Yeah. So the next day, they leave with a dragon transport, and we learn through this how dragons prepare for a long flight because they're loading up the other dragon who came with all of these packages on this like netting on her belly. She teaches Temeraire how to roar. And so they go on the way to where he's headed, which is Loch Lagan, where they will be stationed, where they will be trained. Lawrence asks if he can stop by his family estate, and he is given leave to do so. And when he gets there, his family is having a party, which he wasn't expecting. His father absolutely does not approve of him joining the Corps. He didn't approve of him joining the Navy when he was a kid. Lawrence also uses this as an opportunity to break it off with this woman that he was like tentatively engaged to be married, but they didn't seem like they really had. It was more of a formal kind of agreement.
They made a promise when they were like 9 and 13 is how they describe it, and
Yeah.
she had just been sort of hanging out in the background while he basically got enough money to come home and be worthy of marriage. And now that he's made himself an aviator, he's no longer societally marriage material, so he has to cut it off.
Yeah, he kind of gives her the opportunity because he's like, look, I know that I won't be able to be what you need me to be, and she agrees. And it's kind of like, it's cold, but it's not emotional. But then his mother meets Temeraire, and she's really impressed, and it's very cute that his mother is very kind of approving and, greets Temeraire, and Temeraire and greets her, and it's very, that scene was quite cute.
It's a great characterization scene because Lawrence is kind of too talented and smart and perfect and polished not to be kind of a dildo, in real life. So they kind of fix it by like giving him like really crippling daddy issues. He's constantly kind of has like a chip on his shoulder, and not chip on his shoulder. Chip on his shoulder is the wrong description. He constantly has a very modest opinion of himself, since like he's never really lived up to his father's approval. And even when he shows up at the party, the reason that they're home is because his dad had to leave London because they were so embarrassed by him joining the aviators. And by showing up at the house, his dad literally like kind of disowns him and kicks him out of the house.
Well, he doesn't disown him. He's like, well, I'm not going to disown you. Well, Lawrence thinks he disowns him, but he's like, I'm not doing that, but like, get away from here.
Yeah, he's like, you can't come home. So, which is kind of heartbreaking and sad.
Yeah.
You see sort of why Lawrence was so, worried.
Yeah, and why he has such a tremendous weight of duty that he feels like he needs to follow, because he's trying to show his father that he is worthy of this love. But you also see in this scene, because he decides that he doesn't want to sleep in his bedroom. He decides that he wants to sleep with Temeraire out, even though it's very cold, that he's already starting to realize that the most important person in his family is now Temeraire.
Great characterization all the way around. A+ scene.
While they're flying the next day to the covert, Lawrence makes a joke because Temeraire's like, well, if we don't like what they want us to do, we could just leave. What are they going to do? Stop us? And Lawrence is like, that's not how the army works. And he makes this joke that they could become pirates and he could fill a covert of gold for Temeraire to sleep on. And Temeraire's like, ooh, we should do that. And like not realizing that he's joking. They get to Loch Lagan, and the commanding officer there is actually a dragon named Caleritas. And he's a really huge old dragon. And he doesn't have a harness on, but he has this big chain around his neck, like a decorative chain, like a necklace. And the dragon tells him to go find Granby, and Granby will show him around.
Can I just take a moment to this is the beginning of Lawrence's perspective opening. And it's such a funny scene because Lawrence is like grappling with the fact that a dragon, which he did not until recently realize could be as intelligent as a person, has given him an order. And he's like, well, he is a more senior officer, but he also is a dragon.
Yeah.
And then like the tiny gears in his head start cranking. And then he's like, well, I guess I'll listen to seniority. And then gets over the fact that he's, taking orders from someone he does not think, he used to not think was on the same level as him.
Yeah. Although it makes so much sense for a dragon to be the one training dragons because he like is a dragon. Caleritas is an interesting character. I really like his character. Anyway, we meet Granby, and he is very gruff. You wrote a real rude dick, but gruff works in the notes.
I did. I stand by it. He's a real douche nozzle for the first, I'm going to say 40 pages that he's introduced in.
Not really on page for that whole time, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lawrence learns that he's friends. Or I think he like served on the same dragon as the guy who tried to bond with Temeraire. So he kind of, is feeling this loyalty to his friend. So he's being rude to Lawrence for that reason. But Lawrence gets shown around. There are like these Roman baths there that like keep the eggs warm. So it's where they incubate a lot of eggs. And we learn that like the eggs can sometimes incubate for like a whole decade before they hatch. But Granby's like rude to him the whole time. And then Granby says something to him, but he doesn't say sir at the end. And then he turns to Granby and he's like, sir. And Granby's like, excuse me. And then he's like, you need to refer to me as sir when you speak to me. And Granby's like super pissed by this, but then he does call him sir. And then he calls him sir like sarcastically for a good portion of the book. And Lawrence is like,
be clear, he's Granby's superior officer. So basically what he's just being is like, please refer to me as a superior officer because I am a captain, you are a lieutenant. This is how military etiquette 101 works.
Yeah. Calls him sir sarcastically. He like really emphasizes it afterwards whenever he's referring to Lawrence or like talking to Lawrence. And Lawrence is like, oh, I know he's doing it sarcastically, but I can't like call him out on it. And he's like annoyed that he call him out on it. But later that day, Temeraire asks for a bath after he eats. And we learn that this is actually kind of unusual. Dragons are kind of seen as things that can clean themselves like cats. There are like all these children who are, what are they called? They call them squeakers. Runners, I think they also call them.
Yeah, I don't know the name, but you start in the aviation or in dragon school. If you're going to be a dragon person, either a dragon rider or someone who works on dragons, either actively fighting on a dragon, which is super cool, or just like tends to the dragons in the dragons grounds, you like show up at 8, and usually it's like a family thing. So there's just like a bunch of like 8 and 9-year-old kids running around who are like, we're going to be dragons one day. It's cute.
They are really, really cute. And they are really excited about this prospect of pleading Temeraire because they're really trying to get into the good graces of the riders because they want to get on the riders' crews.
And Lawrence really likes this too, which is like so one of his super cute tendencies is that he also loves kids because he's the perfect, sweetest, hottest, nicest, goodest boy. So like he really like the kids take initiative and he like wants to encourage that. So there's often scenes of Lawrence and a gaggle of children and dragons just hanging out. It's perfect. This book rules.
It's very cute. Yeah, so the kids help him get like linens and stuff, and he takes Temeraire to a nearby lake where Temeraire swims around and then they bathe. Afterwards, he decides that Temeraire doesn't need to wear his harness when he's not being actively ridden because Caleritas is not wearing a harness. So he notices that Temeraire also has like little calluses growing where the straps are kind of rubbing. So he takes it off, and Temeraire is a little like, oh, I don't want the other dragons to think I'm uncivilized.
Yeah, Temeraire is like, "Is this clothing? You have to let me know if it's clothing." So it's not just that Lawrence takes it off. He asked Temeraire if he'd prefer it off, and Temeraire is like, "Oh, I actually think I would." So it's like, once again, Lawrence like deferring to
Yeah.
Temeraire's comfort and needs.
Yeah, and he puts the chain then around Temeraire's finger like a ring, and Temeraire's like, "Okay, that's fine. I feel like I'm not naked anymore if I'm wearing this little ring." And so the harness is still that like kind of jerry-rigged harness that they made on the ship because they haven't made Temeraire a real harness yet, but he takes it anyway to like get it shined. But there's also this little small dragon. I think he's a Winchester. And he's tiny, tiny compared to other dragons. I think Winchesters only get to be 3 tons, which is still huge.
I thought of it as like draft horse size, like big but not crazy.
Yeah, so I looked it up and I think that I looked up orcas. So like they can be 3 tons, like a smaller orca, like a
How
killer whale. They can get bigger than that. So that's like
elephant?
pretty big. Yeah, how big is an elephant?
I'm googling it. They have a lot of
And
bones. That's not helpful.
elephants weigh 2 to 8 tons.
Okay, so about the size of an elephant.
Yeah. And his name is Loitas. He's so cute. And he's like, I want my harness taken off too. And Lawrence kind of says, well, you need to talk to your rider about that. But he kind of notices that the dragon is neglected. And the dragon's like, well, my rider hasn't come in a few days. So Lawrence does like clean the dragon off and he tells his ground crew, one of the characters' names is Mr. Hollins, that they should also attend to Loitas's harness. And Mr. Hollins agrees. He's like, yeah, he's such a small dragon, it won't take very long. And as soon as this dragon was introduced, I was like, oh, this dragon is going to be a lesson to Lawrence and Temeraire, isn't it? And I was right, unfortunately. So the next day, the other dragons are then asking to be bathed as well and for their harnesses to be removed. This is where Lawrence meets Berkeley and Harcourt. Berkeley is the rider for Maximus, who's this huge royal copper that's also just like a little baby at this point. I mean, little is relative. He's still huge. And Harcourt is the rider of Lily, who's a longwing, which is an acid-spitting dragon. Do you want to talk about him meeting Harcourt?
Yeah. This is there's so many good scenes in this book, but this is probably my favorite. So Lawrence is like at dinner eaten up and Harcourt comes in and he's like, "Oh, wow, look at that small thin young man who's so thin and small. They really like let young boys, come and be dragon riders. That's so weird." And then Harcourt talks and it's a woman and it's literally like a jump scare. He's like, "Ah, a lady. Ah, they let ladies here? What?" And then Berkeley has to like explain that long wings, which are a very specific type of dragon that shoot acid. So they're like the most metal dragon.
They're like the most important dragon in the fleet for Britain because of this power.
Yeah, they don't have flamethrowers, so this is the only like real projectile dragon. They drop bombs off dragons, but this is the only one.
The acid is deadly too. We see
Oh,
the acid at work in a later scene, and it is metal. Yeah,
it is metal. So it's just so funny that like that Lawrence just has this like jump scare where he's like, "Oh, women exist." And then just like the dragon thing, it's like he has to call her captain, I believe, because she's a captain because she gets that rank when she spawns a dragon. And he's like, "Miss, I mean captain, I mean, and he's working through it. And once again, he's like,
in his mind.
women, yeah, in his mind, he's like, I how does this make sense? And he's like, well, if they only accept women and it's for the duty, then and women can be captains, then women can be captains, and that's fine and great, and like works on it. And literally, there's scenes of him later being like, Captain Harcourt, because he keeps calling her Miss, and he's like Captain Harcourt. I'm just saying the man is putting in the work to be a feminist.
Yeah, it's like when someone's kind of struggling with pronouns, but they're really trying. It kind of reminds me of that.
It's
Um,
it's just very cute.
yeah, he's really trying, and he does have a lot of respect for Harcourt. But in the beginning, he's like, her shirt was only kept together. The collar of her shirt was only kept together with her like neckerchief thing that they all wear. It's like, yeah, like the same way your shirt is kept together. He's like so like a woman, but he also at first he's thinking like, oh, poor her to have to sacrifice her life to serve this dragon. But he realizes that she does have kind of the same relationship with Lily as he has with Temeraire, where she refers to Lily as my Lily, and she like gets this kind of loving look in her eyes when she describes Lily because she just loves her dragon so much. And it's sweet to see. It's like the way my dog is the best dog, and someone else is like, no, my dog is the best dog. It's kind of the way these people treat their dragons.
I just want to bring one thing back to the women, because it's literally like as soon as he sees one woman, they start popping up everywhere.
Oh yeah.
So he like re-looks at that group of rascals that he was a big fan of, and like the one that's like the ringleader, he takes a second look at that and he's like, wait a minute, that's also a woman. It's so fucking funny.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. He's like, he looks at these like group of kids again and he's like, one of them is a woman. I guess that's fine. And it's the one he likes best too. So it's like,
Yeah, and her name is Emily Rowland.
yeah.
The little kid that he really likes the best, who he thinks shows like the greatest initiative. He also meets someone named Rankin who does not introduce him. So he later realizes this with Rankin, but like in the moment, Rankin just introduces himself as himself, where Berkeley and Harcourt both introduce themselves as the rider of their dragon. And Rankin's like, you don't need to worry so much about your dragon. They take care of themselves. And like we as the audience are like, oh yeah, he's the rider of that neglected dragon. But Lawrence doesn't pick up on this.
I mean, I didn't pick up on it mostly because I was reading this book so freaking fast. It just soared right through. Yeah, Lawrence starts out, and Rankin is like very gentlemanly manners.
Yeah.
And Lawrence is very gentlemanly manners. And the aviators are a less formal group. So Lawrence and Rankin bond together. And Lawrence is like, people don't like Rankin because he's so formal, just like me. And we're like, just wait.
We all know. Yeah, and Rankin is part of, it seems like, the nobility, and he says that like, oh, his family sends the third son of each generation to be a dragon rider, and that's why he's there. They train. We have a training montage. Temeraire is kind of out of spirits because he's realizing that he looks really different from the other dragons, and Lawrence is like, he is the most beautiful of the dragons. Like, my dog is the cutest dog of all the dogs.
Like, don't compare yourself to other dogs, you know, like you're all beautiful and special in your own unique way. There's things that you can do that they can't do. And this is specifically where they point out that like Temeraire is like a much better flyer, both speed wise and maneuverability wise.
And endurance. He has a really high endurance.
He's a good boy.
But Lawrence decides that he's going to get him a necklace chain similar to the one that Caleritas has, and that will like bring up his spirits a little. They then do this endurance test, and Temeraire is like super bored. So they're trying to see how long the dragons can fly at speed, and Temeraire is able to keep up his speed longer than a lot of the other dragons, and he's so bored, and he keeps asking Lawrence, how long has it been? How long has it been? And it's like every 15 minutes where he's like, how long has it been? Anyway, so Lawrence then goes to town with Rankin. Rankin's like, oh, like I can take you on my dragon to town, and then you can get that necklace chain. And this is when he discovers that his dragon is Lewitas. And Rankin is really, really cruel to Lewitas. He's just like very cold to him. He treats him more like an animal than as a companion. Lewitas is like, I tried to get to town really fast. And Lawrence is like, oh yes, you did a good job. And then Rankin's like, don't coddle him. And you're just like, I hate this man.
He treats him more like a car than like an animal. It's crazy.
Yeah, like Lewitas gets them to town really fast, and then he doesn't give him water. And Lawrence is like really pissed by this because it's like he's being cruel to this animal, but he doesn't really say anything because he's like, oh, like I thought he has like rank on him because he's been in the Corps longer, right?
I think they're the same rank because they're both dragon riders, so they're both like captains.
Yeah,
but he's both got years on him because even though he is with the other trainees, he is like a full-fledged aviator, so he's not training, he's just like stationed there. So he's like above them because he's not a trainee, and then also class-wise he's above Lawrence.
Yeah, you're right.
Like I said, most people are Lawrence comes from like middle class Britain, upper class, so like money, but not necessarily like landed in any way. But it's pretty clear that like Rankin comes from land, has like a relationship with the king or something pretty high up.
Yeah, so he really feels like he can't kind of call Rankin out for the way he's treating Lewitas, but he does realize like, oh, this is why other people do not like Rankin. Also, Rankin is not going to go into combat. He's a courier, and we learned that he was made a courier because they thought he would do less damage as a courier, but they were incorrect in that, and he's still like treating his dragon really poorly.
He's a Nepo baby.
Yeah, Lawrence goes into town and he buys Temeraire a platinum chain pendant with a pearl at the center because Temeraire really likes pearls.
There's a very silly banking scene that you're gonna just have to read the book to. It's very cute.
Yeah, Temeraire is so cute, and he just like knows Temeraire is going to like it, but he doesn't. He actually goes back to Levitas early, so he spends an hour with Levitas, and he like orders a sheep, I think, or a goat to be slaughtered for him so that he can eat. And he like kind of cleans him off because he's so pissed at Rankin. But then during the scene where Temeraire receives his pendant, he's just like, oh, I love it. And then they kind of reflect on how lucky they are to have each other, especially since Lawrence sees how awful the relationship is between Levitas and Rankin. Lawrence also tells his ground crew that they should attend to Levitas as well, and they agree. And so they start caring for him as well as the little kids. They also start like cleaning him too. So he's getting all this attention that he deserves, but he still is like, oh, I wish my rider would come. And it's just heartbreaking, this poor little dragon. Get another training montage, and Lawrence really becomes solid in this idea that he really only needs Temeraire to be happy. He doesn't need a wife, he doesn't need a family. Temeraire is his family. So he's really starting to learn that this isn't a bad lot after all, that this is like possibly the best thing that has happened to him, that Temeraire has come into his life. And it's really sweet.
I mean, we also see him and not Rankin. He actually distanced himself from Rankin, and like that's a part of it. But him and Berkeley and Harcut start training in formation and really solidifies them as like a squad. Which is important because they're gonna literally go into battle in the next part of the book.
Yeah, Wally appears and he tells them that a wounded dragon needs their assistance flying, which is something that they trained for. Maximus and Temeraire go to assist this dragon. Temeraire is faster than Maximus, so he gets to the dragon first. While we are on our way to the dragon, we do see they run drills on the dragon's back because the whole crew is on Temeraire. So we get this little insight into how this works. Do you want to describe this?
Sure. So Temeraire has a harness on his back that kind of seems like a backpack from what I understand, except for like the storage is probably on the front if they are carrying anything. Yeah, I think it is. Or on his tummy instead of his back. And then the harness has a lot of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like hooks is not the right word.
Apps with hooks on them that carabiners can attach to.
Yeah, so it's got this whole like carabiner system where people can move around the dragon's back and hook themselves on, but like stay attached to it. And there is 2 complements of fighting units on there. You have musketeers, which will fire at each other, and then also bombers that are used to drop on like ships and armies. So they drop bombs off there. So they like practice dropping bombs off. It's a great scene off the dragon's side. It's so cool. And then there's like other people that are like, there's a flag system so the different dragons can communicate with each other like a ship.
Yeah. They also have like a sound cone that they like yell to each other too. So it's just like really, really well thought out the way that this works. And it's because it's portrayed that they're on the way to this exciting event. When we see how this works, it doesn't just feel like exposition. You feel like really into it. It was very well done the way that she placed this into the novel. So he does get to the dragon before Maximus does, and this dragon is like bleeding. He's very, very heavily injured. He's starting to lose altitude, and there are 2 like very tiny dragons that are trying to support him, but they're just too small to support the dragon's weight. Temeraire kind of comes underneath him so he can kind of support the dragon. But as he does so, the dragon's claws do rip into Temeraire's shoulders, and it slashes one of the main straps on the harness, and the harness is starting to come loose.
And also Temeraire is hurt and flailing around a little bit while there's this giant dragon on top of him.
Yeah, and he's trying to hold it up while he's in this incredible amount of pain. So some of the crew like moves to patch the wounds on Temeraire. They're also like trying to cover the claws with cloth so that the other dragon doesn't harm Temeraire more. But Lawrence notices that this strap is starting to really come apart. So he tells a few of the crew like, give me your like harness, because they all have these like little harnesses around their waists. so that they don't fall off, so they can strap on to Temeraire. And he takes the harnesses, but in order for him to get to the strap that's starting to come loose, he has to undo his own carabiner. So he's kind of just loose on his back. And so he's trying to get these straps as like a patch over the broken strap. And Temeraire gets kind of pushed because he is like trying to settle underneath this other dragon, and Lawrence is starting to fall off, and Temeraire is like yelling at him, and he's like, Lawrence, and Lawrence is yelling back to Temeraire like, you can't try to catch me, you have to continue like supporting this dragon, because Lawrence is realizing like if Temeraire were to stop supporting this dragon, like 20 people could die, and it's not just about him, and Temeraire is obviously not listening to him then. And so he's like starting to fall off, and it's this really dramatic scene. And then Granby catches him and is like, hold on to me. And then he's okay. Yeah. It's a good scene.
Very dramatic.
And then Maximus comes and helps. If this was a different book, this would be the point in the book where you're like, oh, the enemies have become lovers.
Oh, okay. What I was going to say is I think this is what I love about this scene is that like Lawrence finally gets a chance to show off that he's very brave because he goes and risks himself, and that he's very duty bound because it's more important to him to like, save these other people's lives than his own. He talks about like, it's like, well, it's my duty to die so all of these other people can live because it's more important that this happens. And he just gets a really great way of finding out that he's like the specialist, the nicest, and the bestest boy, like through action instead of like him saying it or them telling us.
Instead of the book constantly telling us this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great scene. Also, then Gransberry is just like looks at him and he's like, wait, I thought you were like a piece of shit, but actually you're like super cool and awesome.
Yeah, they start to really respect each other throughout this whole flight, because Lawrence is realizing while they're doing drills and while they're getting closer to the dragon, like Gransby he's like really serious, and he's really taken charge in this way that's been very, very helpful. And he's really calm in the face of this potentially dangerous mission. He already is starting to build a lot of respect for Gransby that he doesn't have here, he didn't have before. And then Granby saves his life and like doesn't gloat. He's just like, this is my duty to like serve my captain. And it's a really great scene.
Also, this is why you put fight scenes in your show, because they're cool and they show character in a way that is important.
But also, that's why it's important that fight scenes are a way of building character and developing plot, instead of just having a fight scene to be like, I think this would be cool.
Or not having a fight scene because you think it'd be funny to not show a fight scene. Anyway, I'm not bitter. Let's keep moving.
All right, they make it back, and Caleritas tells Lawrence that he and Maximus will be officially joining Lily's flight wing, and that he needs to pick his crew. So he pulls Granby aside and kind of, he asks him, and Granby accepts, but then he's like, I've been such a dick. I'm sorry. I'll be better. And it's very cute. So then they become allies instead.
Yeah, Lawrence is still like, this dude is so informal, but I'm just gonna have to take him how he is. And Granby is like, I'm so bad at this, but thank you.
Yeah, it's sweet. So they become allies. And then the next scene is like a cute little beach scene where Temeraire, Lily, Lewitas, and Maximus all go bathing. Berkeley, Harcourt, and Lawrence are also there, along with all the little kids who are like helping them bathe, and they're all like playing in the water, and like you get all of this characterization of the different dragons, and it's quite cute the way that they interact with each other. And it's just such a so sweet scene, but it's really like bittersweet, because when they get back, Rankin is waiting for Lewitas, and he's like slapping his harness against his leg. And he's like, you need to be here when I'm ready to go. And Lawrence tries to say, well, like, you could have sent a signal and we would have been here within the minute. We were just in the lake. And Rankin's like, I shouldn't have to signal for my own dragon. And then he forbids him from spending time with the others. He also forbids the kids from ever going near him again. And he like yells at Lewitas. He like tells Lewitas, he's like, oh, I guess you're wet now. And Lewitas is like, no, I should be dry by now. And it's so heart-wrenching. The little girl, Roland, does kind of say after they leave, she's like, oh, he sucks. And Lawrence has to reprimand her. And then the next day, Caleritas tells Lawrence that he can't interfere with Lewitas anymore, that he has to stay away, because if other potential, like, people who don't have dragons, the lieutenants, know that they could just kind of seduce a dragon who is not being treated as well to their cause. It could cause like chaos in the ranks. But then he does kind of soften and say, look, I think it's a good thing that you did this. So Mr. Hollins does continue to take care of Levitas, and Lawrence just turns a blind eye to it. He doesn't acknowledge it. But this is really the last time that he really interacts with Levitas for a while, which I kind of feel like is his own lawful good nature kind of getting in the way, because he is such a rule follower, that this dragon's life is now worse because he wasn't willing to really like press the issue. We do also learn that Caleritas was supposed to be the dragon that Rankin was supposed to be the rider of, and that Caleritas's first rider was the grandfather of Rankin. He also was the dragon for Rankin's father, but he just could not stand Rankin, so he rejected him. And the next scene, we learn that Temeraire has reached his full growth. He's grown these little like fronds on his face and these little frills around his head, which does further distinguish him from the other European dragons. So he like really likes when his little fronds are touched. We also meet a defected French dragon. His rider's name is Choiseul. Temeraire has this kind of big rivalry with the dragon. We learn that Caleritas is encouraging this rivalry because he noticed that Temeraire was getting kind of bored with working in the formation. And this is helping him really focus because he wants to like really prove himself to this dragon. But yeah, we have this French guy. And when this French guy appeared, I was like, he can't be a spy, can he? That would be way too obvious. Well, he is a spy, but we'll learn that later. So we have a dragon battle. Do you want to talk about the dragon battle?
One thing I love about this book is that it is not afraid to start in media res, which is great. Literally, the book starts at the end of a battle. And this one, we're treated to an ambush, and the reader really gets that because they're like, anyway, and then we go off to Dover. And then all of a sudden it's like, we're getting shot at. Ah! And it's really cool. Basically, they get ambushed on the way to Dover, and there's a bunch of dragons. I don't remember the exact specifics of this fight, I gotta say.
I feel like we don't really know what's going on outside of Temeraire's and Lawrence's experience because they also don't really know what's going on.
There's a lot of stuff about formations and trying to attack different dragons. So the dragons keep trying to come above and below them because that sets off certain formations, and they're trying to isolate specifically Lily's dragon, Temeraire, and what's the big one's name again?
Maximus.
So Temeraire and Maximus are like targeted, but it's mostly to get them out from where they're protecting Lily so they can attack Lily head on, because Lily is a longwing. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
And can spit. So like she's the most dangerous.
Yeah, they do describe how the dragons can't come up from below Lily because she shoots acid downward. So if they come up from below, she could shoot acid at them, so they have to attack her from above. And Lily does get really injured, but they get to Dover.
Yeah, can we go back to the fight a little bit? Sorry. I was just
sure.
So they're ambushed and they're being separated, and Lily gets hurt. And Lily's the lead dragon, so they're not sure who's going to take control. And for a little bit, Lawrence is like, do I take control?
Oh, yeah, right.
And then Choiseul shows up and leads them and gets them. So it's like, oh, maybe he's not bad after all. He just sort of saved us a little bit. There's also like some really good scenes with Temeraire because like when dragons come down on other dragons, it really freaks them out. But Temeraire is just like such a good flyer and smart that he can defeat them and their one trick move.
They mention that it's an instinctual thing. It can't be trained out of dragons, and some dragons will just drop when another dragon comes up from above to try to attack them, and there's just like nothing you can do to train it out of them. But Temeraire isn't a dragon that happens to, but the dragons that are around him are. So he's kind of left without allies when those dragons drop down on him.
Doing a great job of like a beat for beat of this fight scene, so you're just gonna have to read it because it's super cool.
Just like, read this book because it's good. You'll enjoy it.
So they get out of the fight scene.
Yeah, Lily is really badly injured and she improves very slowly. Harcourt is basically with her, attending to her this entire time. And the Frenchman also is really helping her. He starts calling her Catherine instead of Harcourt, which we're like, okay, they're getting to know each other.
Yeah, he's like 30 plus and she's
She's
so
very young.
young. They talk about this in the book, but she was supposed to take Lily, but they thought it would take like 10 years for Lily to hatch, and then Lily hatched super quick. So she's very young and she's also really kind of behind in her training in the same way that Lawrence is. It's also why she's called Lily. It's a really cute scene where they're like, name this dragon, and usually the dragons have Roman names.
Yeah, there's like a tradition of Roman names or like Latin words because they're not all names. Some of them are just words to name the dragons. But
She just names her Lily. It's cute.
do you want to talk about nursing the injured dragon?
Yeah, we see this actually like a couple of times. We see it when Tamara is first hurt, even though it's sort of like a little wound. It's just they're just like they just get all sleepy and they're like, you have to eat, but they don't want to eat. And then they sleep next to them and it's really cute. And she's like sitting there and like touching her and murmuring to her. And like Lawrence, like I said, does something very similar to Temeraire, but you really see this like really beautiful bond between Ryder and Dragon where they're literally inseparable.
Yeah, in this scene, because Lily for a while is not accepting any food, and Lawrence, I think, is sitting with some of the other officers when someone comes in and says, Lily is eating, and they're all like, they cheer because they know that that means that she'll start to improve. So it's not even just the fear for that rider or that rider has for the dragon, it's everyone feeling really like out of sorts because they're also kind of feeling that, like, oh, that fear for them. And it is really quite sweet.
They don't use the word bond in this book, but you really feel the bond between Ryder and Dragon and riders together with that shared understanding of that bond, and everyone who works on a dragon kind of gets it. And that's sort of what they build their community around. You see it with Rankin, and you'll see it a little bit more with Rankin as we tell you what happens next. But people who don't honor that bond or can't feel that bond are really looked down upon the aviators. They're like, they just don't get it, you know? It's like a
Yeah.
moral thing.
Yeah, that's, I think, an important distinction, that it's not just the riders themselves who are the people who are, again, it's not really bonded, but like it is bonded because it's their dragon and they're the dragon's rider, but it's the entire crew that works on that dragon feels that way, which includes the people who are just like cleaning the dragon off and tending to his harness, as well as the people who are like the musketeers on the backs of the dragon. In the next scene, we meet Jane Rowland, who is a rider of another Longwing. I forget her dragon's name. I don't think it's really important. And we find out that she is the mother of Emily Rowland, who is Lawrence's favorite runner. She tells Lawrence that her kid will replace her when she dies on her dragon because her dragon will probably outlive her. And she also tells him, like, you're probably going to need to have a kid to replace you on Temeraire. And she explains that dragons are more likely to accept the heir or like the child of their previous rider than another person because that person understands why they're mourning.
Well, yeah, the loss that they've experienced. It's very romantic where the dragon is passed down through the family, not
Yeah.
because of like genealogy, but because of the shared love of
Yeah.
them. It's really cute.
It is it's quite sweet.
Jane's a really fun character, a very
Yeah.
fun depiction of women because there's not a lot of ladies in this book, but we've got a couple. We've got Emily, who is, pluckish, but basically just one of the boys. And then we have Harcourt, who's basically just as capable as everybody else, but is like a young girl. And then you have Jane Rowland, who is described as literally disfigured. She's got a sword wound on her face that is causing her eye to dip a little bit.
Yeah, her mouth also doesn't have, like, she can't smile like she can't use her muscles on the one side of her face as much.
Yes. So, like, a very accomplished military captain who has a lot of experience that Lawrence, like, really respects and has gone to war a bunch and not very feminine either. She's dressed in uniform, in the male's uniform, which is something he comments on because, it's technically illegal, I believe, for women to dress in, like, pants at this time.
Yeah, they're cross-dressing laws.
And she's just very brisk too. She's a cool character. She makes a joke about that they breed the riders the same way that they breed the dragons. It's both a joke and she's just very like nonchalant about the work.
A real straight talker, she doesn't like couch things.
She's great. And they bone eventually.
They also, like, have sex that night.
Not that night. It's like a couple of
No,
nights.
it's that night because he's thinking about it the next day. I didn't think that they had sex that night either, but the next day he's like, "She's not like the whores."
Okay, I thought it was a different night.
I think they have sex more than once, but it's so blink and you miss it kind of, like, it's not like a big deal. It happens completely off screen, it's really subtle, so if that's not something that you like in books, don't worry, it's just barely there.
There's very little romance between them.
Yeah.
They're just good chaps, and sometimes they hang out in each other's bedroom for a while. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, they're colleagues with benefits, it seems.
Yeah. Yes.
So the next night, Temeraire and Lawrence are together, and Temeraire hears a strange sound, and he says he thinks it's coming from Lily. So Lawrence goes to investigate, and he finds that Choiseul, the French guy, is trying to kidnap Harcourt and by extension Lily. Lawrence is able to attack him, and Harcourt then hits him over the head, knocking him out, so they're able to capture him. The next day, they question him, and Choiseul tells him that Napoleon was actually supposed to be the one to get Temeraire's egg, that the Chinese emperor sent the egg specifically to him, and he was sent to get the egg back because Napoleon doesn't realize that the egg has hatched. He says that he was considering killing Temeraire, but he realized that he couldn't do that. He also says that that's part of why he decided to take the long wing instead. He says that one of his goals was to weaken the covert as much as possible. Jane Roland had left the night before with a contingent of dragons, so there aren't that many dragons left at Dover. And he says that he did all of this because he was terrified that Napoleon was going to execute his dragon. Not execute him, but execute his dragon.
Yeah, it's a fight scene. Lawrence and Choiseul like kind of get at it, and then Hargrove like boinks him.
Lawrence almost loses. It's a kind of gritty fight.
Yeah, because Choiseul is like stronger and kind of beefier. They also add the extra level of Choiseul is kind of grooming Harcourt because she's so young and he's so handsome. Because he was a noble. So when the revolution came and they started kicking them out, he didn't have anywhere to go. And when Napoleon rose to power and
Austria for a while, but then he thinks that Napoleon's going to take Austria, so he came to England. But he also is like, I feel like Napoleon's going to take England too, and because of the intelligence that he's received, and he doesn't want to be on the wrong side of it. And it's really for his dragon's sake, because he's terrified that his dragon's going to get executed. And apparently Napoleon has a history of executing these dragons. So he's just really worried.
Which is unthinkable. It's completely unthinkable. Like,
it's like killing a dog.
Well, it's like more like killing a dragon, It's like they're better than people, They execute people, but we don't execute dragons,
We don't execute. I mean, I think dogs are better than people too, but anyway, so they execute Choiseul. I'm sorry for butchering this name so much, but he's able to convince his dragon to go to the breeding grounds in Newfoundland before they do so, and the dragon is extremely distraught. They have to keep him down with chains. He's screaming while they take Choiseul away, and this makes all of the other dragons completely miserable because they have to kind of grapple with this idea of what if they were on the wrong side. And then Temeraire, Lily, and Maximus all are like, we'll form a pact that will help each other escape if anything like this were to happen to our riders. Temeraire also is like, look, that dragon was absolutely complicit in what he was planning because that dragon is smart. He says that dragon isn't like Wally. He's not simple-minded. He knew what was going on just as much as Choiseul was. And so Temeraire kind of doesn't let that dragon off the hook, which I think is kind of true. That dragon, there's no way that he didn't know what was going on.
So there's after he gets kicked out, there's all of this worry because first off, the dragons have seen the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to them, which is not dying. It's just losing their rider. So they're really upset. And then the humans are upset because they're like, oh, Choiseul tried to get everybody out of Dover. Everyone is, in fact, out of Dover. What's coming? And they find out eventually.
Yeah, then Rankin appears and he has a wound on his thigh. He says that he was able to see Napoleon army building this massive transport to fly his army across the channel instead of use the Navy. There was a Navy battle that previously happened completely off screen where Napoleon's Navy was completely like destroyed because he doesn't have a very good Navy.
The French have a small Navy. Lawrence is following because all of his friends were in that fight. And so that's happening. They've been flying over the channel for a while, but no one can see what's going on in France. And so like they're like, something's going on over there, but we can't see past the water because it's too heavily guarded. And then we find out when Rankin shows up, like what's been going down.
Yeah, so he makes this drawing, like this diagram of what the transports look like, and they basically discover there are like 4 of them, and they could probably hold like up to 2,000 troops each, I think is what he said. So it's a huge army that they're going to be able to move across on these dragons.
It's like an airship tank made of wood flown by dragons.
Yeah, and they're going to come across and land at Dover.
So they can fly over the British Navy, which is too strong.
And basically the dragons can fly high enough that they'll be out of cannon range so that the Navy is basically useless against them. But Lawrence then sees Mr. Hollins kind of leaving, and he
can't find Mr. Hollins.
He can't find Mr. Oh, okay. He goes to find Mr. Hollins then and finds him with Lewitas, who is dying, who has been really brutally wounded. Mr. Hollins is like sitting with Lewitas's head on his lap and is like petting him, and he says to Lawrence like he didn't even have water. There's no one around attending to him. It's so sad. So Lawrence is really angry and he goes to find Rankin. He basically pulls him out of he like dumps him out of his chair. He pulls him out of his collar and he's like, you're going to tell him how brave he was and you're going to be there with him when he dies. And Rankin agrees, and he, just really half-heartedly is like, you were really very brave. And Lewitas is just so happy that he came, and he's like, he came, and that he just even gave him this half-hearted praise, and then he dies, and it's so sad. Ugh.
It's sweet, but it's also heartbreaking.
It's so heartbreaking because he's such a sweet dragon. Lawrence fully expects that he's going to be reprimanded for what he did, but his superior officer is like, so did he die? And Lawrence is like, yeah, he died. And the officer is more concerned by the fact that there's another Winchester egg that's about to hatch, and he doesn't want Rankin to bond that dragon because he took such poor care of this dragon, but they don't really have anyone else that they can give to this dragon. And because of Rankin's family status, he says like, oh, they're going to take it to Parliament if this dragon becomes a feral. So Lawrence suggests Mr. Hollins, and Mr. Hollins is sent to harness this Winchester, which is really sweet. I hope that we see Mr. Hollins and his dragon in a future book. I feel like that would be quite nice to see.
I have read, I'm going to say 20% of the second book, we see Mr. Hollins again.
Oh yeah? Does he have his sweet dragon?
He does have his sweet dragon.
What does he name it?
I do not remember. Oh. That's for a different podcast. Maybe we'll read a different book, but it's really sweet because Mr. Hollins loves dragons, but he's not really in the service. He's more of a support role. So him getting a dragon is like basically unheard of. For him to actually have gotten one in a different way, like everyone would have gone to be like out at a party and a dragon hatch. Like it just would have been impossible for him to get one. So it's really sweet. And also Winchesters are like not, they're small messenger dragons. So they're not very impressive, but because he's such a modest dragon loving fellow, he gets a modest dragon. It's real cute.
I feel like it doesn't matter what kind of dragon you have. It's your favorite because it's your dragon.
That's that is one of the central theses of this book.
Yeah, it's sweet.
All dragons are perfect.
So the next scene is them going to this battle. And it's a very long aerial battle. They see these 4 transports coming. I think they're each being carried by 4 very large French dragons.
There's like 60 dragons on like the French side in this battle, and there's not that many.
I think there are like 23 or something. Or maybe there are 40. There are significantly fewer dragons on the English side.
The Navy's hanging out and is ready, but they're like too far above for the most part. So part of the strategy, they got dragons holding the transports, and then they got dragons fighting, and their job is to take out the transports before they can land on British soil, or England will be lost. It's so cool. It's a great
It
scene.
is a really cool battle. Granby also, like, kicks ass in this battle. He's super cool. They, like, get close to one of the dragon transports or the dragon that's carrying the transport, and they board the dragon, and then they're having
Boarding
this.
dragons is a
Yeah.
thing in this book. It happens multiple times. It's great.
Yeah, they have this battle on the back of this dragon. Lawrence is still on Temeraire, but his crew is now on this other dragon, and they're able to take this dragon, and the way that they take the dragon is they kill the rest of the crew,
Enough of the crew.
or like, yeah, enough of the crew, or like subdue them, and then they hold the rider at gunpoint, and that forces the dragon to obey them because the dragon doesn't want their rider to die. So, like, Lawrence is, like, looking back to see what's happening on the dragon, and Granby is just standing behind the rider with his gun to the back of the rider's head, and then the dragon flies, like, away because 'cause they've captured this dragon, and it's, like, so badass. It's great.
All of this is happening. There's like Lily's attacking a different dragon. They're flying in formation. There's like smaller dragons. They have to have messenger dragons in the fight because they just don't have enough dragons because they're all somewhere else. So they're like pestering other dragons to sort of break up formation. Maximus is just like plowing through people. It's really cool.
Yeah, he, like, bodies a dragon by just, like, blunderbusting through it, and the dragon just can't get out of the way in time. Is that the dragon that he, like, hits against the cliff, and then the Navy shoots it with cannons?
Sure.
There's, like, a
Yes.
dragon that, like, gets hit out of the sky, and he lands on the cliffs, but the cliffs are in range of the cannons, so then the cannons shoot the dragon out of the sky, and it's, like, brutal, but it's, like, really cool.
Great scene.
Yeah, Lily spits acid onto one of the dragons that's holding another transport, and the dragon starts, like, screaming and, like, grabbing its face because the acid is, like, slowly eating away at its skin, and the captain, the rider, has to shoot it in the head, which is really sad, but the rider has to shoot the dragon in the head because the acid's going to kill it anyway. So the other crew members are able to get off the dragon, but the rider decides to go basically down with his dragon, and they both just, like, disappear into the ocean. And it's, like, really intense. It's a really intense battle.
Everything about this scene is metal.
Yeah, it's a really good battle. It's sad. One of the transports does, like, landfall, and, like, the troops start pouring out, and they're like, "Oh, no." And it looks very grim. It looks like they're going to lose the battle because they're just being so outmaneuvered because they have so many more dragons on the French side. But then Temeraire takes this big breath, and he shoots this sound cannon, and it destroys part of one of the transports, and it causes the one dragon holding the transport to, like, start bleeding out of its face, and it has to land prematurely. And then they realize that they can still win it. So he starts flying around at full speed because he's really fast and maneuverable, and he is able to shoot down enough dragons and, like, damage the transports enough that the French do retreat. I also, like, missed a section because Temeraire, for most of the battle, is without his crew because they boarded that other dragon, which leaves him very, very vulnerable because he doesn't have the musketmen then shooting at the dragons who are trying to come down at him, and he doesn't have the crew to then protect him from getting boarded as well. So they are in this really precarious position, and Lawrence does have to, like, fight off people who are trying to board Temeraire as well. It's a really cool battle.
Yeah, it's a really great scene too. Temeraire in the battle feels like a real sense of duty to protect basically all the people he loves because, Maximus and Lily and all the people there, along with like his crew he spent a lot of time with. And it's a little corny, but there's literally a line where Temeraire is like, I finally understand the meaning of duty and why you serve. And then like levels up and unleashes his new growl weapon.
Yeah, I can read. I have the description of it.
Yes.
Temeraire stopped and hovered in midair before the oncoming dragon, spreading his wings as if to bar the way, his ruff raised instinctively up, the webbed skin translucent gray in the sunlight. A slow, deep shudder passed along his length, and he drew a breath, and his sides swelled out even further against his massive ribcage, making the bones stand out in relief. There was a strange, stretched tight quality to his skin, so Lawrence began to be alarmed. He could feel the air moving beneath, echoing, resonating in the chambers of Temeraire's lungs. A low reverberation seemed to build throughout Temeraire's flesh, like a drum beat rolling. Temeraire, Lawrence called, or tried to. He could not hear himself speak at all. He felt a single tremendous shudder travel forward along Temeraire's body, all the gathered breath caught up in the motion. Temeraire opened his jaws, and what emerged was a roar that was less sound than force, a terrible wave of noise, so vast it seemed to distort the air before him. He has a special power. It's more special than breathing fire.
Yeah. And it saves the day. Literally, like, once he unleashes it, he just starts, like, bellowing it out, and they're like, well, this isn't gonna work. Everyone back to France. Bye-bye."
Yeah, so they win the battle, and then the next scene is they're at a victory ball. The dragons are all outside watching this orchestra. There's a scene earlier where the dragons talk about how they would have liked to see this orchestra that was playing, but they couldn't get close enough. So they set up this orchestra specifically for the dragon. And like when Lawrence walks outside, Lily and Maximus are like talking to a violinist who's playing just for them, and they're asking all these questions to the violinist, and the violinist is like obviously preening and like very like proud of being able to perform for these two dragons. It's very cute.
First, the orchestra people are like, I mean, it's just like an encapsulation of everyone's reaction to a dragon, which at first the orchestra people were like, "Yeah, dragon, I'm
Yeah.
afraid." And then they're like, "No, these dragons rule. They're better than the people. I want to hang out with them."
Yeah, what a good audience. They're like really intrigued and interested in, in what we're doing. It's very cute. So he finds Temeraire, who's speaking to Sir Edward Howe.
From earlier in the book.
Yeah, the dragon enthusiast. And Edward Howe is like, yeah, so surprising no one, Temeraire is actually the celestial dragon. And we know this because only celestials are able to do that sound cannon.
Also, looks like the picture once his fronds came in.
He has little fronds.
He just like a juvenile dragon didn't look like that. The book ends with them being like, actually, he's the most specialist dragon. We were wrong.
And that night, Temeraire and Lawrence fall asleep together, and Temeraire's like, it's so silly that Napoleon thought he could have me because I wouldn't have accepted anyone other than you. And Lawrence is like, same here. And then they fall asleep together. And that's the end of the book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
It's a great book. You should read it.
We do not do it justice.
No, we don't. It's fantastic. It was just delightful to read.
Just some of my favorite dragons to start with because they're smart and funny and perfect. And I like that there's so many different types. I really like the bond not necessarily being, it kind of seems like imprinting to some degree, like birds, but like there's nothing really magical about it, but it's still just as beautiful as important, even though it's not like they're in each other's heads and they're feeling each other's like positions. It's like a very much more grounded version of the bond than we've like seen that I really.
Yeah, this is the first bond that isn't like a mental or a magical bond, but is a bond. It really feels like the kind of bond you have with a dog.
This book made me wanna pet my dog more. Like, it just really makes you appreciate the animals in your life.
Yeah, it really like if you haven't had that kind of experience with a pet, I think everyone needs to have that experience with a pet sometime in their life where you're just like, this animal is kind of my life, and it makes my day better just knowing that they exist, and it makes my day better just being able to sit with them.
And we make our lives better together with the relationship that we have. That sounds like a weird thing to describe with, like, an animal because you tend to think of it as sort of always going one way, but it is a relationship that, like, goes 2 different ways, and in different ways you improve each other's lives, and I think it's really sweet to see that in a book.
And it's a really unique relationship, and it's different from like the kinds of relationships you have with a human, because people have relationships that are complex with multiple people throughout their lives. Even like if you have a soulmate and you really believe in soulmates, your partner still probably has complex relationships with their friends and family. Whereas like the relationship you have with an animal, you're the only two people who have that relationship with each other. As an animal, like when they bond to you, you are their person and they are also your creature. So it's just like really intimate in that way, and this book portrays it really well. It reminds me a lot of like you hear stories about people who like bond a crow and they have to change their whole life in order to keep this crow. And it's like this 30-year commitment because the crows live for so long, but they're totally fine with it and they're okay with like that crow being their partner. You know what I'm talking about?
Don't, but I understand what you're talking about, even though I did not have this knowledge before you gave it to me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like you hear about that sometimes where people like have a crow. It's like your soul dog. Everyone has like a soul dog in their life, I feel like, where that they just have this really special bond with a dog. And like the dog can really pick up on their emotion and their feelings, and you can really pick up on the dog's emotions and feelings. And your life is just better because they're in it. And their life, is better because you're in it and you just have this really special relationship with it. And it really felt very sincere. Like she obviously just really understood that kind of relationship. It didn't feel forced, and she was able to show it so perfectly through the interactions. Like we never were told that the characters felt this way. We were always shown the characters felt this way through the events of the novel and the way that they interacted with each other. It was just really masterfully done, really well done.
I think you and me have like a very specific relationship with animals and that other people
Yeah.
will different, but I think this is a very good description of a specific type of relationship you can have with an animal. Which
Yeah.
is really great. Which is funny because like these are like pretty human dragons. Like they come out speaking English, and some of them are quite smart. And some of them are quite dumb, but like how people are quite smart and quite dumb. But it's still, you see the animal and the animal human, which is what we like about dragons, because sometimes dragons can be very animalistic and sometimes they can just be people that can shape change into dragons, or are like these mythic gods who have been around for all time, like speak the
Yeah.
truth of the universe. So I like this version of dragon where it's like animals, but like the way people are animals.
I think this was my favorite version of like the quote unquote bonded dragon so far. I like this version better than Aragon, and I like this version better than Dragonflight.
Where it's about choosing instead of some external magic force.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the magic force is bad, but I feel like I I understood the bond. It didn't have to be explained to me through exposition for me to understand why it was so important to these characters. It was shown to me through these actions where I feel like in the other two books it was like explained in multiple ways. Also, the dragons were just like on screen more. Like Lawrence wants to be with his dragon constantly. All of them want to be with their dragons constantly, except for Rankin, but he's a douche. Where like in Dragonflight and Aragon, they're like not on screen for most of the book. They're like off doing other things. And you're like, why?
Too, a lot of times dragons are too
Yeah.
overpowered to be in a scene. And I'm glad that they fixed that problem by adding more dragons to the scene. That's the right call.
Yeah. I think I said in when we recorded Aragon, I was like, "Oh, this was the right amount of dragon in the book." But actually, now that I've read His Majesty's dragon is the right amount of dragon in the book, which is a fuck ton of dragons.
Yeah, current gold standards, a lot of dragons, mostly on screen all the time, sometimes fighting each other.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's like a good tip for our next book, which we'll talk about later because there's still some more stuff I wanted to talk about. Yeah, it's so interesting that we got a lot of dragon eggs, but not a lot of dragon husbandry, which I feel like if there's a book, there's going to be some dragon husbandry in it. But so we know about the breeding grounds, but they're just sort of over there. Like it's kind of like
Yeah.
the bad place, you know? It's just sort of like if you're bad or if you're not a good dragon because you're feral, you get sent to the breeding grounds and it's probably fine, but you're kind of off at a corner, not doing your duty.
I think that's true because when he tells Caleritas that Temeraire has reached full growth, so Caleritas is like, "Great, we'll have to send that information to our experts, and we can try to figure out some good crosses for Temeraire." So I think it's not necessarily like a punishment, but it does happen like over there.
It's sort of seen like the same way Lawrence was talking about getting married. You know, it's like that's something you do like after your service. It was kind of funny.
Yeah, it does on screen and we don't see it. Like we don't have to like hear about two dragons having sex in the background at Loch Lagan. Like it just is a thing that we mention. Although it does mention like I think he thinks that Temeraire is getting like turned on when he is like touching his little fronds.
Yeah. He's like he likes his Franz touch and he's like, well, not doing that again, but good to know.
Yeah, and then he's like talking to Claritas and he's like, "Does he need to be serviced?" And Claritas is like, "No, because we're like people, we can control ourselves." And Lawrence is like, "Oh, good." And then it doesn't come up again, which is nice.
I forgot about that. See, this is so funny. I like that they is like dragons boning because this is a dragon book and we gotta cover it. And Clavitas is like, we're people, calm down. And he's like, fair enough. Oh, good.
Yeah. Yeah, so no dragon husbandry on page in the book, which is nice.
Did you have a favorite dragon breed? I was gonna ask.
I mean, I don't know because I feel like because Temeraire is just so cute and lovely.
Yeah.
I did really like I think Wally was, like, dumb. I don't know if that's, like, his breed. He was just so cute. I loved his relationship with his rider.
The Winchesters were really cute,
Yeah, the Winchesters are so
the
cute.
I wanna go fast. They've also are multiple times described as being covered in small children, which I think has to be adorable.
Yeah.
I was gonna say if I had to pick a not, because obviously Tamarind's the best dragon,
Yeah, he's best
that's
dragon.
how it's supposed to work. I really like the long wings, only like ladies shoot acid, have like bones sticking out of their face, they're pretty good, but I do have a soft spot for Maximus's dragon, the royal coppers, which are just like the size of a castle.
Yeah, they're huge. I think they say at one point that he's, like, 150 feet long, which is huge.
Yeah, he reminds me a little bit of a Bronchiosaurus. A funny thing is he keeps growing and they keep having to like borrow people from other dragon transports to just man him because he's so massive.
Yeah.
It's great. He's a great dragon. Also, yeah, Lily's kind of sassy and Maximus is just like, I'm here for a good time.
Maximus is kinda sassy too, like, he, like, needles his rider a lot. There's a point where, like, Berkeley is talking about I forget exactly what the context is, but I think he's, like, poking fun at Maximus for being so big, and then Maximus is like, "Excuse me, your doctor told me that you need to lose weight." And so they're kinda, like, poking fun at each other for both being kind of big. I feel like it's also the kind of thing where, like, you look like your dog, you look like your dragon, where, like, Berkeley's kind of a bigger, more portly guy, and Maximus is just like a huge dragon. Harcourt is this slip of a girl, and I feel like Lily is this really sinuous
Yeah.
dragon because she's quite long, but her wings are so big that like it's yeah, I don't know. The Winchesters are super cute though. I don't know. How can you pick a favorite dragon? They're all so wonderful.
Yeah, we didn't get to see a lot of French dragons either. We just know one of them breathes fire, and there's like different sized ones.
Yeah, there's a French one that breathes fire. There's also a Spanish dragon that breathes fire, which is where we get the long wings from. So the long wings are actually a cross between a Spanish fire-breathing dragon and a dragon that's indigenous to like the British Isles. And the first long wing apparently was bred during Queen Elizabeth's reign, which may be the context for why they like female riders. And we're apparently like in this alternate history, like the reason she beat the Armada, which is like I like the idea of her riding into battle on a dragon. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, they don't change too much about world events. With dragons, everything happens exactly as you thought it would, and but they're just dragons now, so it's way cooler.
Yeah.
I really liked they were like discussing a historical battle and they were talking about a different historical battle that had dragons in it, and I just really the way that the dragons are incorporated into the actual events of the time is just very seamless and you never feel like
Mhm.
that's not how it would have gone. You would have been like, yeah, I think if the Napoleons were like fighting dragons or the Chinese had been breeding dragons for 5,000 years and if like this is what they would have looked like and this is how they would have acted.
I yeah, also there's like Lawrence mentions that he saw a Michelangelo painting and the painting like it was of the second coming and there are dragons breathing fire on like the sinners. And I love that because you know Michelangelo would have painted some dragons if he could, if dragons were real. I guess he could have painted them if they weren't real, and he didn't really. Yeah, it just is very seamless the way. I would love to like know what the Romans did with dragons because I feel like there would be some cool things that they did. They like because they like had like pet eels that they would like put earrings on the eels on their gills. They like decorate them. So like I kind of can imagine like how they would decorate their dragons.
So that's what I thought about dragons. As far as dragon books go, this is honest. It was great. Really enjoyed the dragons. We've been talking about canon and like the way that books create the canon of like with the earlier books, and then how different books within the canon inform specific books like Guard's Guard was specifically interacting with like stereotypes about dragons. And I thought it was really interesting. This is probably one of the first books we've had not in a while, but like this book doesn't really have much interest in engaging with like a lot of tropes about dragons. Like it does bring the tropes in, but it sort of uses them as like a baseboard to then like build up on top of.
It really makes them its own thing. It makes them feel very unique. It doesn't feel like, "Oh, we're doing the bonded thing again." Just like, fine, I'm totally fine with the bonded thing being a thing again, but it makes it's such its own thing that you really do feel like you're reading something new. And I think the places that it really borrows from, like, the canon of literature in general is just, like, the story beats, where it's like, "Oh, you know that Levitas is going to die as soon as he's introduced because he needs to teach Lawrence and Temeraire a lesson about their relationship with each other, and you know that the French guy is going to be a spy because of course he would be, and you know that Temeraire is going to have a really cool breath ability because he's so interested in breathing fire in the beginning that if it just like wasn't brought up again, it would kind of feel weird. So it's borrowing from like ideas of like how a story is crafted, but again, in a really unique and enjoyable way. It doesn't feel like we're just watching Star Wars, but with dragons, the way that Aragon kind of felt.
I was going to say it takes the basic structure of storytelling and
Yeah.
executes it very competently. So the reader knows what ride they're on, but really puts its own mark on all of them. I mean, we talk a thing we haven't talked about is that this is actually in a canon that we haven't looked at before. Like you've been talking about Master and
Yeah.
Commander. There's a whole section of like historical battles and naval battles that this like borrows from the canon that like we
Yeah.
just don't have the experience to talk about because I've never even seen Master and Commander.
Oh my god, we should watch it. It's so
We
good.
we're well that yes, we're gonna watch that in Twilight, and
Oh, what was the other one we were gonna watch?
that one was a good movie, I believe. Not that Twilight is
Oh, we are gonna watch Pride and
Pride and
Prejudice.
Prejudice because I've never seen Pride and Prejudice or read it.
Or read. I can't believe that. I can't believe you didn't have to read it in
Yeah,
school.
I just watched Fire Island, which is loosely based off of it, so that's the closest I've gotten. Anyway.
I don't know what that is.
It's really interesting to take 2 canons, like the dragon from the fantasy canon, and then elements from, like, the naval and, like,
Yeah.
war, and, like, merge them together so seamlessly to really add a fresh take, I assume, to both.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear what someone who does have a background in and really does like those kinds of historical fiction books or even just history books or a knowledge of this, because this is like, I don't know anything about the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, what we need is someone doing a canonical nonsense podcast, but instead about dragons, purely about nautical battles and the Napoleonic Wars.
Alternative histories in the Napoleonic Wars. So if you read this book and you also have a knowledge of the Napoleonic Wars and you want to give us your 2 cents on how you feel like it melded the 2, we'd love to hear it. So please share that with us. I would be so interested to know what your thoughts are, positive or negative, on that portrayal.
I just have, like, one more thing we can add before we wrap up because we've been going really long, but I really enjoyed this story as I think a really interesting instance because we were talking about story structure, and this book very
Mhm.
clearly understands story structure, but it does something that you typically don't see in a lot of books, which is that the character of Lawrence doesn't really undergo much character growth in the same way that you would typically expect. Like, he doesn't want to necessarily, like, be an aviator, and in the end, he does wanna be an aviator, but he doesn't really change throughout the story.
He is as a person, it's not different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, he starts as, like, a very loyal, very confident, very duty-driven man, and in the end, he is a very loyal, a very confident, duty-driven man, but, like, on the back of a dragon with some new friends. He learns he learns that women exist and not to be sexist, and that, like, dragons are people too, but those are just like, he's already got those moral characteristics in him.
Really a conflict. He just like he is able to kind of grapple with those facts because of his own personality. Like he doesn't have to change anything about him, his preconceived notion or his personality in order to accept those. He's able to reframe it within his own understanding. No one has to like teach him how to accept those things. He's able to do it because of who he is as a person.
And is that's usually, like, kind of a faux pas in a story. Usually, you wanna take your main
Mhm.
character from a place of, lack to a place of growth, but you don't always need to. Like, there are stories that you can do that with characters that don't change, and I think this is a
Yeah.
beautiful example of that, and the way you kinda do it is you kinda need to have everybody else in the story change around Lawrence. So, like, throughout the
Yeah. Well, especially it's Temeraire who he has experienced change through Temeraire's, like, growth as a character, so even though he's not changing as a character, because Temeraire is growing and changing as a character, he is experiencing it himself too.
what I think is really interesting is that throughout the book, you see people be sort of put off by, like, Lawrence's dedication to duty and honor. It's his dad pretty early on who thinks that his
Yeah.
commitment to, like, defending the country is bad, and that taking the step to further his commitment by, like, taking up this dragon is, like, the worst thing he could do. And then you also see it in Gansby's really good about this. And then to some degree, Temeraire doesn't quite understand it. Like Temeraire is like,
Yeah.
why would I follow these orders? Like, I care about you and I want to make you happy, and this makes you happy, but like I don't understand all of this. And then literally like at the climax of the book, Tamaryn's like, I understand honor and duty right now. So that it's I just thought it was really interesting and I wanted to bring it up
I think that is really interesting.
because I like because we like it's a book that really understands story structure and it like kind of breaks one of the cardinal rules, but like shows
Mhm.
you how you can break that rule and still have a story that feels compelling and engaging by like having change in the book, but not necessarily fully in the main character.
What do you think specifically about Lawrence's character makes him work? Because like, Fuller is a character who doesn't change throughout the course of the novel and is infuriating because of it.
Well, he's humble. That really helps.
Yeah, I think the humbleness, but it's not even just like a humble out exterior, he's humble internally too, so he never really thinks that he's doing he never thinks that what he's doing is right. What he's doing feels very instinctual to who he is as a person.
He also is wrong at times. He, like, is right later. He doesn't the book doesn't super let him fail, like, things go wrong.
Mhm.
Part of it is his choice, but and there's still conflict in it. It's just not
Yeah.
necessarily his internal conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, he really fails with Levitas. Like, he could have pressed the issue because I think there could have been a case made that Rankin was abusing this dragon and to try to have this dragon taken from him or something changed, and he doesn't press the issue anymore. He just is like, "I'm gonna follow my superiors," and that's, like, a failure of his character because of who he is, and it's sad, but it works because, like, it would be out of character for him to have pressed the issue and to second guess a superior officer when Coleritas tells him that he has to stop. And I think that's really important to show that, like, even though there really wasn't much he could have done, maybe was some things that he could have done. Like, he could have broken the rules to help this dragon, and he just decided not to because that's not who he was. And that shows that his character does have weaknesses, even though they aren't like shoved in our face, and they aren't fatal weaknesses.
The commitment to, like, a greater good, to, like, duty and country gets in the way, but, like, in the end, duty wins out. The book tries to, like, talk between, like, when all of this gentleman formality is important because it has a goal behind it, like cohesion, unity, friendship, and, like,
Mhm.
when it's just there to protect the powerful or the
Yeah.
cruel, and, like, there's a conflict in that. It's a good book. Go read it.
It's a really good book. Go read it, especially if you do want your main character to be, like, the bestest boy. This is a really great place to look at where it's done successfully.
I also think it's just because he's, like, 37 instead of 17. There should be
Yeah, he's older. We never mentioned this. He's, like, definitely in his mid-30s at least, if not older in this book. He is not very young, so he has seen the world, and he has kind of come to the solid point in who he is as a person before the book begins. We're not seeing him develop his character
Yeah, he was
throughout the
7
book.
books into a different series, a very different series by the time
Yeah.
Temeraire shows up.
This is Russell Crowe's character at the very end of Master and Commander. If that French ship at the end of Master and Commander had a dragon egg on it.
Alright, well, speaking of books that are, like, kind of in other genres, I think it's time to tease our next book.
Yeah, so what are we reading next?
We are reading Tooth and Claw by Jo Walton, a Jo.
Another Joe. Third Joe.
So we picked this. We don't really, I mean, we don't super know what this book is about. It's been sort of described as Pride and Prejudice with dragons, not in the same way this was Master and Commander with dragons, as in, like, what if everyone in Pride and Prejudice was a dragon?
It's not a Pride and Prejudice retelling though, is it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But I don't know what happens in Pride and Prejudice, so I can't tell you. Like, as long as no one's called
Okay.
Mr. Darcy, I'd have no idea what is like, I would be like,
Well, we'll find out.
"You'll find out, and then you'll tell me."
Yeah, if Lydia Bennet is a dragon, ooh, that could be very bad for the other people in the book.
I'll take your word on it. But so I was really interested, we kind of talked about this on sort of what happens when you merge two canons together, especially since we've got a relatively okay understanding now, I feel like, of the dragon canon that we're looking at. So I thought it'd be interesting to compare two books that are really intentional mergings of like the dragon fantasy canon with a different sort of genre canon, like a Regency book is what I think this is.
Yeah.
So that's why we wanted to read it.
I'm excited for it. Well, that's all we have for today. This has been His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and hit the subscribe button.
What were your thoughts on His Majesty's Dragon? Would you recommend this book to others? Let us know in the comments or tell us what other dragon books you would like us to read.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.